Hello and welcome to IMC Radio and Podcast. Today we're exploring the top news headlines for March 4th, a whirlwind of events across the globe. Let's start with a concerning development in the Middle East. The Trump administration has bypassed Congress to send $4 billion in arms to Israel, the second such instance in just a month. This move has drawn sharp criticism, especially considering the types of weaponry involved, including 2,000-pound bombs intended for use in densely populated Gaza. What are the implications of bypassing the usual congressional oversight on such significant arms deals?
Well, it's a move that raises questions about checks and balances in U.S. foreign policy. The administration argues it's crucial for Israel's security against Hamas, especially after the October attacks and hostage situation. However, critics worry about the potential for escalation and civilian casualties given the nature of the weapons and the volatile situation in Gaza.
The conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo is also escalating. The M23 rebel group is advancing, displacing thousands, and the DRC is refusing to negotiate directly with them. They see Rwanda as the real aggressor, citing a UN report alleging Rwandan troop support for the rebels.
The DRC's stance is firm. Rwanda must withdraw its forces and engage in peace talks before any negotiations with M23 can happen. Rwanda, however, denies these accusations, claiming they're acting in their own national security interests. It's a complex situation with accusations from both sides. Rwanda points to DRC collaboration with the FDLR, a group linked to the Rwandan genocide, further adding to the tension.
Meanwhile, back in Russia, an explosion has rocked the Ufimsky oil refinery, the country's largest. While the Russian government attributes the fire to technical issues and downplays any impact on production, concerns are mounting over the increasing frequency of such incidents in Russia.
These statements have understandably caused tension in the historically strong U.S.-Canada relationship. King Charles has also invited Trump to Scotland for a state visit, suggesting a potential effort to navigate these diplomatic complexities.
In a show of support for Ukraine, UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has announced a £1.6 billion missile deal following a summit with European leaders. This deal builds on a previous agreement ensuring annual export finance for Ukraine to acquire British military equipment.
This contrasts with President Trump's recent criticism of Ukrainian President Zelensky for a perceived lack of gratitude towards U.S. aid, revealing differing opinions on the level and expression of support for Ukraine. The UK's commitment emphasizes the evolving dynamics of international support for Ukraine, with various players navigating their roles in the conflict.
A UK court has blocked the deportation of a Nigerian man convicted of armed robbery and drug dealing based on claims of demonic possession.
The judge's ruling highlights the complexities of balancing criminal justice with concerns about the man's mental health and the potential risks he would face if returned to Nigeria, especially considering societal attitudes toward mental illness there. Amnesty International's reports on this issue further underscore the ethical and legal considerations in such cases.
The Niger Republic junta has announced a new requirement for WhatsApp and Facebook groups with 50 or more members to obtain government licenses. They cite concerns about social media being used for cyber warfare against them and the need for regulation for tax purposes.
This move is seen as a potential attempt to control online discourse and stifle dissent, raising concerns about freedom of expression and access to information in Niger.
Finally, in a move escalating the trade war, Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau has imposed retaliatory tariffs on $155 billion worth of U.S. goods. This comes in response to the U.S. imposing tariffs on Canadian exports and energy.
Trudeau has warned that American consumers will bear the brunt of these tariffs, facing higher prices on everyday goods. This trade war, a classic example of protectionist policies backfiring, highlights the interconnectedness of global economies and the potential for far-reaching consequences. It's fascinating how these seemingly disparate events are actually intertwined in complex ways. For instance, the conflict in the DRC and the arms sales to Israel both highlight the global arms trade and its impact on regional stability. While geographically distant, these situations underscore the far-reaching consequences of military aid and the need for responsible arms control measures.
You're right, it's like a chain reaction. The arms race in one region can fuel instability and conflict in another, and it's often civilians who pay the ultimate price.
Precisely. It's also worth noting the role of economic interests in these conflicts. The DRC, for example, is rich in natural resources, and control over those resources is a key factor driving the conflict.
And in the case of the trade war between the U.S. and Canada, economic interests are clearly at the forefront. Both sides are trying to protect their own industries and workers. But the tariffs are ultimately hurting consumers on both sides of the border.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how economic nationalism can backfire and lead to unintended consequences.
Speaking of unintended consequences, The Niger Republic junta's crackdown on social media is a prime example of how attempts to control information can ultimately harm those in power.
Absolutely. By restricting access to information and stifling dissent, the junta is only fueling further distrust and resentment among the population. It's a short-sighted strategy that will likely backfire in the long run.
It's also a reminder of the power of social media as a tool for both good and bad. In the hands of authoritarian regimes, it can be used to spread propaganda and control the narrative. But in the hands of ordinary citizens, it can be a powerful force for change.
Indeed, we've seen countless examples of social movements and protests being organized and amplified through social media. It's a tool that can empower individuals and hold those in power accountable.
But it's also important to be mindful of the potential for misinformation and manipulation on social media.
Absolutely. Critical thinking and media literacy are more important than ever in today's digital age.
So as we continue to explore these headlines, I think it's important to keep these broader themes in mind. They provide context and help us understand the interconnectedness of these events.
They also highlight the challenges and opportunities facing the world today. From the fragility of peace to the power of technology, we're living in a time of profound transformation.
And it's up to all of us to shape the future we want to see.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's delve into a story that might seem less dramatic on the surface, but has significant implications for international relations. Trudeau's meeting with King Charles.
It's fascinating how King Charles, despite his largely ceremonial role, seems to be stepping into a more active diplomatic role, particularly regarding these tensions between the U.S. and Canada.
What's intriguing is how this situation reveals the subtle dynamics within the Commonwealth. Canada, though independent, still recognizes the British monarch as head of state. This historical tie creates a unique avenue for dialogue, even amidst disagreements with a close ally like the U.S.
It's almost like King Charles is acting as a neutral intermediary, someone who can facilitate communication and perhaps help smooth over some of the rough edges in this relationship.
It speaks to the enduring influence of historical ties and soft power diplomacy. Sometimes it's not about military might or economic sanctions, but about leveraging these long-standing relationships to navigate complex geopolitical situations.
It'll be interesting to see if anything concrete emerges from these discussions. But even the symbolism of this meeting is significant.
Absolutely. It underscores the importance of diplomacy and dialogue, particularly in times of heightened tension.
And now let's circle back to the UK support for Ukraine. The contrast between their actions and President Trump's criticisms of Zelensky is quite stark.
It highlights the shifting landscape of international alliances and the different approaches to supporting Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. The UK, under Starmer, seems to be taking a more proactive and assertive stance, even willing to commit troops if a peace agreement is reached.
Whereas Trump's rhetoric seems to be more focused on transactional relationships and what he perceives as a lack of gratitude from Ukraine.
It's a reminder that even among allies, there can be divergent views on how to address complex geopolitical challenges, and that these differences can sometimes lead to friction.
It also raises questions about the long-term impact of these different approaches.
Will the UK's more proactive stance lead to greater unity among Western allies, or will it create further divisions? And will Trump's transactional approach ultimately undermine US credibility and influence on the world stage?
These are questions that will continue to unfold in the coming months and years, but they underscore the importance of understanding these different perspectives and how they shape the global landscape.
Now, speaking of shifting landscapes, let's consider the story about the explosion at the Russian refinery. While the Russian government is downplaying the incident, it raises concerns about the vulnerability of critical infrastructure, particularly in the context of the ongoing conflict with Ukraine.
Whether it was an accident sabotage or something else entirely, it highlights the potential for disruption and the need for heightened security measures.
It also reminds us of the interconnectedness of global energy markets. Any disruption to Russia's oil production could have ripple effects on global prices and supply chains.
It's a reminder that we're all vulnerable to these kinds of shocks, and that diversification and resilience are key.
Absolutely. This incident also underscores the potential for escalation in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. If Ukraine is indeed targeting Russian infrastructure, it could lead to a dangerous spiral of retaliation.
And that could have devastating consequences for both countries and the wider region.
It's a reminder that even as we navigate these complex geopolitical challenges, we need to prioritize diplomacy and peaceful resolutions. The stakes are simply too high for anything else.
Now, before we move on, I want to touch on a story that might seem less significant on the surface, but has important implications for democracy and the rule of law. the Edo State Governorship Election Tribunal in Nigeria. The fact that the tribunal reserved judgment after hearing arguments from both sides is a testament to the importance of due process and the need for a fair and impartial judiciary.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that even in countries with a history of electoral irregularities and political turmoil, there are institutions and individuals working to uphold democratic principles.
The outcome of this case will be closely watched as it could set a precedent for future elections and the role of the judiciary in ensuring free and fair elections.
It's a reminder that democracy is a fragile thing, and it requires constant vigilance and the commitment of citizens and institutions alike to protect it.
So as we wrap up this segment of our exploration of today's news, I'm struck by the sheer diversity of the challenges facing the world today. From armed conflicts and trade wars to political instability and social media censorship, it's a complex and ever-changing landscape.
But it's also a landscape full of opportunities for positive change. If we can learn from these events, engage in constructive dialogue, and work together, we can build a more peaceful, just, and sustainable future.
Well said. Let's move on to part 3 of our exploration. Welcome back to the show. Before we wrap up, I want to touch on a few stories that might not have dominated the headlines but still offer valuable insights. The case of the Nigerian man in the UK who avoided deportation by claiming demonic possession has sparked debate about the intersection of law, mental health, and cultural understanding.
Yeah, it's a complex case that challenges us to look beyond the surface. While the man has a criminal record, his mental health struggles and the potential dangers he might face in Nigeria raise serious concerns. The judge's decision, prioritizing the man's well-being over strict legal consequences, underscores the need for a nuanced approach to justice.
It really does. This case also prompts reflection on how we perceive and address cultural differences.
Right. The belief in demonic possession, a reality for some cultures, shouldn't be easily dismissed. It emphasizes the importance of cultural sensitivity and the need to approach such situations with empathy and open-mindedness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, for a story that adds another layer to the already complicated diplomatic dance between the US, Canada, and the UK, President Trump has invited King Charles to Scotland for a state visit following the King's meeting with Trudeau, where they discussed Trump's controversial remarks about annexing Canada.
It seems King Charles is maneuvering carefully, aiming to maintain ties with the U.S. while acknowledging Canadian concerns. This highlights the subtle power of diplomacy and the potential for even symbolic gestures to influence international relations.
Very interesting. Finally, let's bring our focus closer to home and acknowledge a challenge impacting many of our listeners. The rising cost of living continues to strain households, driven by a combination of global factors including supply chain disruptions, the war in Ukraine, and soaring energy prices.
Inflation is a global issue affecting everything from groceries and gas to housing and healthcare, with governments struggling to find effective solutions. It's a reminder that we're all interconnected, and navigating these challenges requires collective effort and support.
So true. Well, that brings us to the end of our exploration of today's top news. We covered a lot of ground today, from the Middle East to the DRC to right here at home. It's clear that we're living in a complex and rapidly changing world. But as we've discussed throughout the show, there are also reasons for hope.
Absolutely. We've seen examples of courage, resilience, and innovation in the face of adversity. And by staying informed, engaged, and connected, we can all contribute to building a better future.
Thank you for listening to today's top news headlines on IAMC Radio and Podcast.